welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. And what do these things have in common? Intravenous chemotherapy, fire sprinklers, stone crushers, they're the key to paving roads, and the erector sets. Well, all of these items and many more were invented in the city of New Haven. Well, here to tell us the very interesting backstories on these inventions, which you will find very intriguing, is somebody we've had on Amazing Tales before. He's Jason Bischoff Wurstel, and he's Director of Photo Archives at the New Haven Museum. He's going to be along in just a moment. This week's trivia question: when we think of French military leaders who helped the American Revolution, well, the name Rochambeau is usually at the top. Who was the other prominent Frenchman who played a major role? Stay tuned after the main program for the answer, because that'll give you the topic for next week's show. Well, today's episode is simply a series of back-to-back great stories about some rather amazing inventions, all of them which took place in New Haven. Now, to be fair to the Elm City, there is a very long list of inventions credited to New Haven. Well, our episode today is only going to highlight a handful of them because that's all the time we have, but you're going to get the full backstory of how these came about. And here to tell us these stories is a person who's no stranger to amazing tales, Jason Bischoff Wurstel. He's Director of Photo Archives at the New Haven Museum. Jason, I want to start off with something that I think most observers of Connecticut history have probably heard this story about the frisbee and Yale University. Can you put facts behind the stories and maybe what people have heard over the years?
The name Frisbee came from a man named William Russell Frisbee, and it was spelled Frisbie. He founded a Frisbee pie company in 1871 in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And so as part of producing the pies, they made these tins. The tins said Frisbee pie. So actually about 40 years later, at Yale, on the New Haven Green, students were tossing these tins around. So this idea of frisbeeing. And it was also at other campuses as well. So like Dartmouth, Harvard, kind of, what we consider the Ivy League. So that's where this name Frisbee came from. Then, though, the idea of what we think of as a frisbee, this plastic device, that was more post-World War II, a California invention. They kept kind of making these discs and finding out how to make them better and just experimenting with this idea of creating a flying saucer. A representative from the Wham-O company saw this, immediately said, "This is fantastic," and made an offer. They began to produce these things. It was just a wild coincidence, it seems, that around the time they were trying to launch the plastic discs, make them more popular, the original Frisbee company based in Bridgeport went out of business. And so the actual name could get applied to these discs, albeit spelled differently.
I love it. Now, there's a lot less sort of a nebulous side to the A.C. Gilbert Company and its introduction of the erector set into society. Tell us the story of Mr. Gilbert.
He was born in Oregon in 1884. Always had this very strong competitive streak. He was kind of similar, I guess, in some regards to Theodore Roosevelt. Very competitive, but not really that healthy as a child. Both very clever and what have you, and large personalities. He developed a love for magic very early on. So he went on to become a world-famous magician. And this is and you have to think about this, is late 1800s. So magic had not only that entertainment value, to say today's magicians are, still can be very big stars. But this was, your kind of rock star sort of thing. And also just the idea that magic itself could indeed be magic. You could be a sorcerer. He did end up excelling at athletics. So similar to how Theodore Roosevelt, became a Rough Rider. He was very good at track, gymnastics, wrestling, boxing. He ended up competing at the Olympics in 1908, and he won a gold medal for pole vaulting. He had also, what had brought him here to New Haven was he was studying medicine at Yale. He earned a medical degree in 1909. He borrowed money from his father, and he started the Misto Manufacturing Company. They were making magic kits. The A.C. Gilbert building, Erector Square, actually, which is a series of kind of artist studios and what have you now, the building in Fairhaven here in New Haven is adjacent to the railroad. So just, think about this. So his idea came from, he's taking the train in New York from New Haven. It's 1912. He's watching the construction of the railroad going from steam to electricity. And he's watching girders carrying lines. And he's also watching, as they cross the bridges and even the construction going on in the city. And he's observing all this. So when he got home, he started making girders, just kind of playing with the idea. Then he took it to a local tool maker, and they made little mini steel girders. And this evolved into the erector set, like a Lego set. You could build not only the set itself, but you could also just build whatever you wanted. The key to think about this is he created basically the first mass-marketed toys, the toy aisle. But the erector set essentially created that idea of the sort of mass-marketed toys that were identical in each set that you were buying. Not just the girder building sets, but magic sets, as I mentioned, tools, mineralogy sets, and even chemistry sets. And the chemistry sets, let's put it this way, you wouldn't be selling those toys today. like what was included in those sets, the different elements and, shall we say, radioactive elements.
Now, downtown New Haven, of course, we always hear a lot about pizza, but I'm going to skip to the Louis Lunch, the restaurant there, where it is said by some the hamburger had its origin. Now, I've also heard that it started in Hamburg, New York. I don't know what the truth is, and I'm not sure anybody does, but New Haven certainly has a dog in this race, right?
Yeah. I don't want to go out and say anything against the Lassen family, of which Louis' Lunch is derived from, and that was Louis Lassen. It's the innovation of something and when it's happening, and building upon that innovation. Because it's similar in food regard. Often it's said that Pepe's here in New Haven was the first pizza place. It's not that cut and dry. There were other pizza places, but it's of a certain style, and more so that stuck and stayed in business and continued with what they had innovated. So Louis' Lunch, the innovation being there, when he moved to New Haven, eventually from Denmark, he was a food peddler. He sold items from a cart, butter, eggs, and expanded that to lunch items. And that's really innovative when you think about it. Well, we have food trucks now, so essentially you get your lunch from the food truck. When people didn't have access to, obviously, cars, working people wouldn't have access to basically their own horse, their own carriage. This is a time period where the cities, especially something like a place like New Haven, were growing rapidly due to massive immigration. You had massive industrialization at the same time. So you were working really long hours, raising, by our standards, large families in, essentially tenements, and you might have a grocery down the way. So this food peddler idea came in as this, you could get a quick meal. And so what his innovation was, in his lunch idea, was he took a meat puck and these ground steak trimmings and put them between two slices of toast. And there you have something that sounds very similar to a hamburger. It was inexpensive for him to produce. That was very affordable to buy. That kind of like almost the early days of what you'd think is obviously fast food.
Now, at another store in downtown New Haven, there was some more innovation going on with food, and this was by a guy named George Smith, who ran a store on, I think it was Grand Avenue, and he was experimenting with hard candy. Where did that go?
What it became was the official lollipop. And so that was patented. They had started producing lollipops in 1908, but it took all the way until 1931 for them to actually get the patent. The idea today, it's fairly generic. It's kind of similar, as I was mentioning about the frisbee. Similar idea. People call candies lollipops. However, he was the first to apply that name to hard candy on a stick. Basically, that's what it was. It was like you dip the stick in and you let the candy harden. The name came supposedly from a racehorse, Lollipop. Its patented name is two separate names. We tend to just think of it as one name today. You just took like a stick, you'd have like warm, hard candy as it's coming out, and you place it on the stick. You could flatten it out and, let it harden, and that's the candy. They were first sold here in America, here in New Haven, for a penny.
Switching gears to Yale New Haven Hospital from food to medical, and the whole topic of chemotherapy. Quite an interesting background there at Yale New Haven. Could you explain that?
The first intravenous chemotherapy treatment for cancer took place at what is today Yale New Haven Hospital in 1942. The patient's name at that point, in the records, is only known as JD. This person had been born in Poland in 1894, and they'd immigrated to the United States and lived in Meriden, Connecticut, and worked at a ball bearing factory. Worked there until 1940 when he first became quite ill, unfortunately. He started going to the New Haven Hospital, which would later be known as Yale New Haven. Came in around 1941. Tonsils were enlarged. Basically had this malignant tumor of his lymph nodes, so cancer. They were trying to apply radiation, and it wasn't working. So this being 1941, the Yale School of Medicine, researchers and doctors, et cetera, have been working on, as many kind of college campuses were developing, and specific departments were developing top secret programs for the U.S. government. It's like the Manhattan Project, nuclear weapons and physicists and what have you. Concentrations of incredible minds working together. In the case of the Yale School of Medicine, they've been working on these possible treatments against chemical warfare. People were like, this just could happen. And they've been developing this and said, why don't we try this on JD? Because his tumors were only getting worse, and he agreed to it. This was the beginning of intravenous chemotherapy, so again, different from radiation. Received injections, and as the story went, he actually improved for some time, but then also, as generally what happens, it can improve for some time, it can almost seemingly go away, and then returns in a different form or stronger form or a different spot. And ultimately, JD did pass away within a year or so. But the importance overall was that this application went from being just, a theory and possibility to the treatment that is worldwide and known today.
Now, going into the industrial field a little, the great industrialization of big cities, and that absolutely was happening in the 1800s. And something that they absolutely needed during that time was something to suppress fire. And it turns out that the fire sprinkler was actually invented in New Haven. Can you tell us that story?
A specific fire sprinkler was patented here in New Haven, and generally is known as the Parmalee system. This came about in 1874. The name for Parmalee came from a man named Henry Parmalee. He owned the Methusic Piano Works, and his main motivation for trying to perfect this sprinkler head was the fact that in the years after the Civil War, insurance costs were just skyrocketing. And so it's kind of like twofold. You have to think about it in this way. Post-Civil War, just that idea of insurance already was booming. Obviously, at Hartford, what was and still remains, I believe, is like insurance capital of the world. So this is a relatively new thing that you received insurance and so many things. So there was that. But then also, yes, as we were saying, you have this mass industrialization. You don't have housing codes. You don't have building codes. The chance for fire was pretty frequent. Thus, these insurance bills would be very high. So Parmalee didn't want to pay these high bills. And he was trying to haggle with the insurance companies to the point where he just went about designing his own sprinkler head. And the basis of the sprinkler head was they used this solder that would melt. So once it was sort of detected by smoke and heat, the solder would release, and then the water that was kept in the pipes would then be able to spray out and help minimize the fire damage. They still work to this day. It became so important that in the first 8 years after Parmalee patented this, over 200,000 of these sprinkler heads were installed across New England. A lot of it, the sales, though, then also came about by Parmalee actually appealing to the people he was fighting against. So he got in bed with the insurance industry, essentially, and said, hey, look, my invention actually saves you costs, saves you money, you still make it in a different way. Let's try to, team together, essentially, and market my invention.
One of the inventions from New Haven that may just be undersung in terms of its importance, but is still used to this very day and made the entire development of our country and really the world possible, and that was the stone crusher. Could you tell us the story behind the Blake brothers?
Yeah, I always love this idea here that, in effect, the idea of paved roads, and think about paved roads, there's paved roads everywhere, kind of more or less in its current form came from New Haven. So the Blake brothers were related to Eli Whitney of the cotton gin, of his armory in Westville. They were nephews and had a factory in Westville. Westville is clearly part of New Haven, but it's a separate sort of neighborhood. It developed as its own village, maybe a mile or so, 2 miles maximum from the Green. But again, going back to when I mentioned earlier about people being able to afford horses, you don't have cars. It was only really in New Haven, once the horse-drawn trolley system came into effect in the mid-1800s, that you started connecting these sort of far-flung areas in New Haven. And the same principle happened in cities across the country, the world, etc. Once you were tied closer together through direct transportation, it made trade easier, it annexed cities, and made things larger. So the transport back and forth, the connecting road between the Green of New Haven, downtown, and Westville is Whaley Avenue. While the trolley was working out, Whaley Avenue was just rutted. It was still an old road. It wasn't paved. It wasn't cobblestoned. It wasn't a very comfortable ride. But due to the prevalence of this trolley system and the connections between the village and downtown, and the frequency of use was higher, so they were going to pave it. And that required the crushing of stones. To this point, before the stone crusher was invented, you'd have a crew of people just sitting there smashing stones. You'd kind of lay them out and they'd be tarred. It was a lot of work. It was hot. It was just not good. Blake noticed this happening and thought about this and came up with this idea that basically the stones themselves would be crushed as the road was being paved out. It would be kind of produced, crushed, and it was made more of a uniform, we'd call small gravel today. and then it was easier to apply and smoother. So it was more of a uniform, paved asphalt road. And this uniformity was obviously easier, cheaper, became kind of just the way that roads would develop.
And one of the Blake brothers had another invention to his name beyond that stone crusher, one that you wine drinkers will thank him for. Yes, he invented the modern corkscrew. Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales About History, except for a few other notable inventions from New Haven. I told you there was a long list. They had the first telephone book, sulfur matches that you could strike to light, the first self-playing organ, and the port where Robert Fulton's steamship first arrived following its first test run. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Jason Bischoff-Wurstel, Director of the Photo Archive Collection at the New Haven Museum. The answer to this week's trivia question: when we think of French military leaders who helped the American Revolution, Rochambeau's name is usually at the top. Who was the other prominent Frenchman who played a major role? Well, the answer is the Marquis de Lafayette. And next week on Amazing Tales, the amazing story of Lafayette. He was one of the richest men in France at the time. He left his country behind to come fight for the patriot cause, paying his own way, and accumulated several incredibly heroic victories along the way, and you'll hear that story. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe, and please stay healthy.